This lecture is going to cover Module 10, Microsoft Access. Alright, so the objectives of this module are to understand databases. We're going to talk about how to create a database, create a table in Datasheet view, create a table in Design view, modify a table and set properties, enter data in a table, edit data in Datasheet view, and then create and use a form. Alright, so understanding databases. First off, Access is a database management system, or a DBMS. And a database is an organized collection of related information. Databases, some of the things they can help you do are store information, retrieve information, and connect information together. And what that means is databases, the fundamental building block of databases are the data tables. Looks similar to data like that would be presented in a spreadsheet form with columns and rows. And in databases, the idea is to store information in one place and not multiple places, and then relate the tables together for situations where you have data that is related to each other but not necessarily the same data. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And one more thing about Access, it is what I would call a desktop database management system. It's something that's used for small businesses, small organizations, or maybe a particular task in an organization. It's not one of your larger databases that can scale to a corporate or enterprise level. So just keep that in mind. The concepts are the same. It's just targeted for a smaller user group. So as I mentioned, databases, the fundamental building block of a database is a table. This is an example of what a table would look like in Microsoft Access. You can see the field names or the column headers across the top. The columns are called fields. The rows are called records. So a field contains the same data or the same data point for all records in a database, where the record contains all the data for let's say for an individual, a store. The data in a record is related to each other, as where the data in a field or a column is just the same data point for all the entries in the database. Let's see, form. So we've talked about a table. There are three other main objects in Access that we're going to work with. Those are forms, reports, and queries. So the first object we've talked about is the table. The second one is a form. Now a form can be used for viewing data. It can be used for inputting data. It's basically its main primary function is to work with data or work with an individual record at a time. So this view, you have all of the records in the table shown. When you're looking at a table from a form view, you're looking at one record at a time. So, and you can add records, delete records, edit records. That's the primary function of a form, is to allow you to work with the data one record at a time. Okay. The next object is a report, and let me blow this up a little bit so we can see it a little bit better. Alright, so the report you can see here has got field names, it's got records on it. It's basically just a prepared format that someone can use to print out information out of a database or email a report, one or the other. I will say that in Access, the reporting module is not my favorite. Typically, most databases, the data is exported into a spreadsheet format. That's a more friendlier format than the reporting module in Access, but we will cover how to use reports in Microsoft Access. All right, and let's see, we haven't talked about a query yet, but here are the 4 objects that I just mentioned. A table, that is a list of data organized in rows for the records, and columns are the fields. The query is a set of criteria that you specify to retrieve data from a database that's similar to a Google search. You type in what you're looking for, and the Google servers will query their databases and return either web pages or whatever the question was that you input. A form we discussed, that's a window that lets you view, enter, and edit a database one record at a time. Reporting is a summary of database information designed specifically for distributing or printing. Okay, so now that we've talked about the 4 main objects in a database, and remember those objects, because when you're working in Microsoft Access, you're going to be working with one of those 4 objects at all times. It's a little different from the other applications that we've worked with to this point in Microsoft Office, because typically you're only working with a Word document, a spreadsheet, a PowerPoint file. Within Access, you have 4 different objects that you're working with. So it's just an extra step that you have to remember and understand. So when we look at how to create a database, there are a couple of ways to do that. Just like any other Microsoft Office application, we can start with a blank database, or we can use a template. Now you may remember that from the other applications that we've talked or discussed to this point, is you either start from scratch or you can use a template, which is basically a file that has already been started for you. You just add the data, okay, or it's already been formatted for you. You just add the data. So creating a database with a template can save time, as we would expect. It's a ready-made database object, such as tables with field names appropriate to particular types of database. And when you first start Access, the screen opens and displays a variety of templates you can use. So let's take a look at that right now. We'll go over to Access. So when you open Access, this is what you'll see. It's similar to the other startup screens that you've seen in the other Microsoft Office applications. You've got a blank database. You've got a custom web application, product inventory. Let's see. You've got contacts database, students database, event manager, nutrition tracking. There's all sorts of templates that you can use. Time card, personal account ledger, vehicle maintenance. There's really a long list of templates you can use to create your database. But we're going to create one from scratch using the blank database option. Once we click the blank database option, it's going to ask us for a name. We're going to say CIS 146, and then we're going to click the Create button, and that creates a database. Alright, and we'll wait for Access to catch up with us. It's thinking. Alright, so while Access is creating the database, we'll flip back over to our PowerPoint. Alright, so we talked about this slide. Let's move on to the next. Alright, so creating a table in, let's see, did we skip a slide there? No, we're on slide 10. So we can create, we created our database. Now the next thing that we want to do is add some data to our database, because without data, a database is useless. You can't make any queries, any forms, or any reports from your database without any data. So the data is stored in the table. So the first thing we would want to do is create a table, input our data. So when we're working with a new database, a blank table opens in Datasheet View. We'll show you that in just a second. And in Datasheet View, you can add fields and view the data contained in the table. Before beginning to add fields to a table, it's a good idea to save the table with an appropriate name. So you always want to save. You want to save regularly in Access, because you have different objects you're working with. If you don't save them, Access will be asking you to save them a little more frequently than most objects, like your forms, reports, queries, things like that. So each object within Access that you create will need to be saved. I just mentioned that last bullet point. Alright, so let's take a look at our database. Exit screen. Okay, so Now we have a blank database. We've got a table. You can see it's just the default name is table 1. We can add, let's see, we'll just add short text. We'll call that students. Okay. So we name, that's our column or our field name. We'll add another one. Let's see, short text. We'll call this grade. Okay, and that's how you add fields to your database. You click the header, add the column header or the field header, and then just type and press enter, and it'll give you the option to add a new one. So in this case, let's see, ID is the default. You're always going to have an auto number ID by default column. That's what this is. It carries the data type of auto number. We'll get to data types in a minute. We'll just say, let's see, student Flintstone Fred. And this isn't the best way to do that, but we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll just say Fred made a grade of A. Okay, and you can enter data that way. Once you press enter, after you've entered all the data required for that record, it'll go to the next row, and then we can add another another record. Let's say Barney Rubble also made an A. Okay, so you get the idea, and you can add as many fields as you like and as many records as you like. All right, so that's the start of our table. Okay, and we'll also say we want to save it. We're going to call this one students. So I just merely click the save icon at the top left corner. It asks me what I wanted to save my table as, students. Click OK, and now we've got a table saved. All right. Let's see. So let's move to the next slide. So when we create a table in Datasheet view, which is what we were just doing, the view that we were looking at just a second ago is called Datasheet view. It looks very similar to a spreadsheet. In that view, you can add fields, records, and the data. So you can add the field headers, you can select a data type, and you can add data. There's one other way to create a table that we'll get to in just a minute. So as you saw, to add a field to the table, you specify its data type, such as date or currency. We selected short text. Every database must contain one field that is designated as a primary key, which uniquely identifies each record among all other records in the database. That, in our table, was the ID column. By default, Microsoft Access is always going to have an ID column unless you change it. This is going to be specified as the primary key because one has to be specified. And you can see that's what our third bullet point says there as well. So a primary key is a unique identifier. Just like every student at Shelton has an S number, that's a unique identifier for you at Shelton State. All of us should have a social security number, which is also a unique identifier. A driver's license number is also a unique identifier. A unique identifier is something that if we search for the information tied to that unique identifier, we're always going to get the record for that person. Okay, so that's what a primary key is. If we search for that primary key, whether it's a ID number, a driver's license number, S number, we're always going to pull up that individual's information. Okay, so that's how when using a database you avoid confusing information. You avoid getting information confused because you use that primary key. All right, moving right along. So it's often easier to add fields to a new and existing table using Design View, which we'll get to in just a second. I'll demonstrate that. In Design View, you can use a grid to enter fields that specify field data types. In addition, you can add field descriptions that identify the purpose of that field and help users understand the information that field is meant to contain, and using Design View to change the designated primary key. So let's take a look at Design View. So one thing you're going to need to understand when you're dealing with Access is there's several different views, just like any other Microsoft Office program. So top left corner, you've got the ruler, the triangle, and the pencil. That will take you to Design View, or you can click the drop down arrow and select Design View. You can see you've got two views for a table, Datasheet View and design view. Looking at the same information, just two different ways. So in design view, you can see that it shows the fields that we have in our table already: ID, students, grade. Okay. What design view deals with is merely the structure of the table. You're not going to add any data into the table in design view. So for example, let's say I changed my mind here and I wanted to use a last name insert a row here, first name, short text, grade, let's do date of birth. Now, date of birth, the data type would be date. Okay, and I'll go ahead and touch on data types while we're here. Data type specifies the type of data that we're storing. And you can see here our selections: long text, short text, number, large number, date, time, currency, auto number, which you can see is used for our primary key, yes, no, a hyperlink, attachment. So the reason why that is important is because different types of data require different amounts of memory in your database. So for example, short text is a string of text 255 characters or less. Most of the time short text is going to apply. Long text is something greater than 255. If you have a database that stores sections of legal documents or a legal statute or something like that, and you need a block of text longer than 255 characters, that is what long text would be. Date and time merely will store a date and time. Number is a number. The reason why we want to specify numerals as numbers is if we want to use them in mathematical calculations. Now, that begs the question, should every number be stored as a number? The answer to that question is no. For example, your driver's license number, or a telephone number, or your social security number. We're not going to use those types of numbers to perform calculations, right? We would use those types of we would use numbers, maybe say an inventory, to calculate how much inventory, or add how much inventory. So this is why you have data types. This is why you specify data types, so we can tell the database what the data is and how we intend to use it. Okay. All right. So let's flip back over, and I added email, and that would be a hyperlink. So when we click the link, it would generate an email for us. Doesn't have to be. It can be stored as short text, but it would be more useful as a hyperlink. All right. So back to our presentation. Covered this slide. So once we get our table created, and we need to go back and modify something or add something, we're going to do that in design view. It makes the most sense because you're just dealing with the structure of the table. And in design view, you can also set field properties. You can set input validation, so we make sure that we get the right type of input in our fields, and things like that. So let's exit out of here and go take a look at our table now. So we added first name, last name, kept grade, date of birth, and email. So we're going to save this, and we're going to switch over to database view, or excuse me, datasheet view, and now you can see those fields show up in our table. All right, now I need to change up some of the data I have, and you would probably not want to make a change to a table after you've input a lot of data where you have to split the info, because that could take some doing. Alright, let's see. I'm going to say he was born the day after, 7/2. Alright, we're going to leave the email blank for now. Okay. Alright. So we've modified we created a table in datasheet view, we modified it in design view. We talked about field properties. So if a field name is long, technical, or uses abbreviations, you may want to change its caption property, which is a label that appears in a form or datasheet view in place of a name. And one thing to remember, you know, when you use field properties or captions, which can be done here. So here's a caption. We could put, you know, if we had some technical term in our database, we could say this is what that means. You could add that and you have to select whichever field you want to work with. You'll notice the bottom field properties changes as I select a different field name. You can see the field size for short text shows up as 255. Hyperlink, it shows that it doesn't have a format. Date and time, it doesn't have a format. Short text, field size 255. Let's see what if we put in address and put long text. Let's see what it says. It's not going to have a format because really anything longer than 255. So the format for first name and last name, that gives you the limit, the character limit there. All right, but the point I was going to make about properties and captions is you may create this database and move on to a new job, or you may go into a job where somebody else has created a database and you have to modify it. You're charged with maintaining it and modify it. Well, it would be nice if the creator of the database gave you some hints or some deep information to let you know exactly what those fields were intended to be, so you don't have to guess, right? Same thing in programming. If you're a computer programmer or major, you've probably heard of comments by now. You know, comments, you add comments to your code, which they don't really add anything to the functionality of the program. It just explains what that section of the program is supposed to do, so you can understand the frame of mind the programmer was in when he created that section of the program. Same thing here, not quite as complex, but the same thing. All right, so we enter data in a table. You saw me enter data into a table. That's merely typing and pressing tab or arrowing over to the next column. Very simple. It's just like entering text or entering information into Microsoft Excel. We talked about a row of each of the table being one record where all that data is related. Row selector at the left of each record lets you select the entire record or records. An example of that would be clicking on Datasheet View. Yes, I want to save the table. Alright, selecting here, you can see I've selected the entire row, or I can click and drag. I can select both rows. Okay. We talked about the field names at the top of each table, or at the top of the table. And then the data we enter in each field is called a field value. So Flintstone is a field value. Fred is a field value. The grade of A is a field value. Alright, so that's what those are. Let's see. So, did we skip a slide? No, we enter data. So edit data in Datasheet View. So again, we can enter data in Datasheet View. We can also edit data in Datasheet View just like we can in a spreadsheet. You just simply click and type, remove, using your text editing skills that you learned from Microsoft Word. You can delete, backspace, highlight, delete, really enter it, really edit it just like you would anywhere else in Microsoft Office. Let's see, and then that last bullet, when editing, you may find it helpful to resize columns to make the data easier to see. You may recall from Microsoft Excel, if you notice I just double clicked on that margin, AutoFit we used in Microsoft Excel. See, you can click on the boundary or the margin, the boundary between the two columns that you want to resize. If I want to resize last name, I would click the boundary to the right, and it's going to automatically resize that column. Okay, you see that? Sometimes if you want to take up less space, that you can. If your column if the information in your column or your column header needs more space, it'll expand. So AutoFit applies in Microsoft Access as well. Okay. Printing objects in Access. So you can print information out of Access just like any other Microsoft Office. Usually you're going to create a report that includes selected fields to do that, but there may be times that you want to print a data sheet or form. You can do that. Really all you have to do is select To print an object out of Access, just select that object in the navigation pane, click the File tab, and click Print. The print page opens, and the Backstage view displays the printing options. So we want to select the table in the navigation pane, which is right here. File, Print. We want to do a print preview first. Alright, so this is what our table would look like. Notice, not all of our information is on one page. So we would probably want to adjust that. We would probably want to change the landscape. Now, there's all of our information on one page. We click print, this is what we would get. So you can print an object right out of Microsoft Access. You don't have to create a report. Reports tend to make things a little cleaner, but they do require a lot of work. And if you'll also notice that you can export to Excel spreadsheet, so you can take the information in the table, export it to Excel, and you may want to print it from there since it's a more friendlier format. Okay. All right. Moving on. Alright, create and use a form. So when entering and editing records, it's more efficient to use a form. Form, like we mentioned earlier, displays the database information one record at a time and contains form controls, which are devices for inputting data such as text boxes, list arrows, and check boxes. The simplest method to create a form is to click the Form button on the Create tab. So what we want to do here is you always create a form, a query, or a report based on some information in the database. So in this case, if we want to create a form that makes it easier for us to input data into our students table, we would want to select the students table, create, find the group for forms. We want to create a form. We're going to use the form wizard. I highly recommend using the wizard in Access, and it'll think about it. Alright, so it asks us some questions. Which table or queries do we want to create our form on, based on? Well, the only table we have is students at this point, so that's going to be the table we want to use. Which fields do we want to include in our form? Well, we want to use all of them. So we can select them one at a time, or we can use the double arrow and move them all over at once. Okay, we want to include all of our fields. Let's see, next, we're usually, for the purposes of this class, we're going to go with a columnar layout. Shouldn't change much. We're going to call this form the students form. We'll just call it students input form, or we'll just call it students form. Okay, and if you'll notice, the last question it asks is, do you want to open the form or modify the form's design? And you have an option for each. What this is asking you is, do you want to open the form as is, as we've just created it in the wizard, or do you want to go into Design View and further modify your form? Most of the time, for a form, you're just going to open the form. Now for a query, that would be more of a situation where you would modify the design once you've got the query created, but we'll talk about queries when we get to them. Alright, so we click Finish, wait for Access to create our form. And it's working. And then once the form is created, you'll see it added to the navigation pane to the left. And you'll be able to access it at any time. Also, one thing I want to point out while we're waiting is you'll notice the drop down arrow that I've got my cursor hovered over right now, and there's our form. Always make sure that you are looking at all Access objects. Make sure that that is checked, because what happens if it's not is students will create something like the form that we just created, but if they only have tables listed to display in the navigation pane, they'll think that they created the form, but where did it go? So make sure that you always are looking at all Access objects. So now you see our table, students table, and our form as a student form. Okay, so what the form is displaying now is the information that we've populated into our table. Okay, Flintstone, Fred Flintstone, grade of A, date of birth. I haven't input an email address. I can put Fred at bedrock.com. We can say his address is 123 Bedrock Street. And let's see, we're going to say that's Bedrock, USA. Alright. So now he's got all of his information in. We click the next. Click the next to the next record. We're going to give Barney an email address of Barney at bedrock.com. And we're going to say he lives across the street at 124 Bedrock Street. And that's in Bedrock, USA. Alright. Tab. And then when I tab, it's asking me for a new record. So we've edited the existing record. Do I want to add a new record? I can add a new record from here. I can put in Wilma's information. We'll say Wilma made an A. We'll say her birth date is 9/1/1900. Email would be Wilma at bedrock.com. And she lives with Fred at 123 Bedrock Street. Bedrock, USA. Okay, so you guys get the gist, and I can continue on. Now, I'm going to save my data, and now I want to go back and see if the data that I just added appears in my table. So I click over on the tab for my students table, and wait a minute. Where'd it go? There's no Wilma. We've got an email address, but where did it go? If you'll notice here, I have the option to refresh all. And when I click refresh, now there's Wilma and her information. I can double click and expand so I can see the full address. Okay, so that's how we add data to a table through a form. And a form is really just an interface. You know, most of the things that you see on the internet, or most of the websites that you see on the internet, where it's asking you to input data, that is really a form that's on the web that inputs data, and it saves it and writes it back to whatever database that company is using. Okay, so that's, you know, forms are pretty common. Let's see, I believe that's our last slide for module 10, so I'm going to stop the lecture here. If you got any questions, just please let me know. Thank you.